Aliens left a baby dragon to die until a human cowboy heard a tiny voice cry for mama. Part 1: The Wreckage on the Mesa. The sky over the Ray's ranch had been wrong since before dawn. Hector noticed it the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without ceremony, the way a man notices a gate left open or a cloud sitting too low on the wrong side of the mountains. He'd been up since 4:30, same as always, and he'd stepped onto his porch with his coffee still too hot to drink and felt the air against his face and known, without being able to say exactly why, that the morning was carrying something in it that mornings weren't supposed to carry. The sky to the east was the color of old iron, not the usual pre-dawn purple that bled into pink and then into the particular shade of gold that the New Mexico desert did better than anywhere else on Earth, that reliable, generous gold that had greeted Hector Ray's every morning of his 43 years on this land. No, this morning the east was iron, flat, strange, as though the sky had gone quiet in the way a horse goes quiet just before it bolts. He stood on the porch and drank his coffee and watched the iron sky and listened. Nothing, crickets, the soft percussion of Dulce shifting weight in her stall 50 yards away, the distant, dry complaint of a coyote finishing its night. And then, just before the horizon gave up its first pale smear of actual morning, a sound came out of the east that Hector had no name for. It was not a boom, it was not a crash. It was something in between those things and something entirely apart from both, a deep, resonant concussion that he felt more in his sternum than his ears, followed by a long vibration that moved through the ground beneath his boots like the earth was clearing its throat. The coffee mug rattled against the porch railing. Somewhere in the henhouse, all 12 of his chickens screamed at once. Hector set down his mug. He stood very still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the eastern edge of his property where the land rose sharply into the mesa, a flat-topped shelf of red sandstone and juniper that marked the boundary of what his grandfather had always called the Good Land, and what the county map called Parcel 7C. The mesa was roughly 2 miles out. In the growing light, he thought he could see something on the horizon that hadn't been there yesterday, a faint smudge of dark against the iron sky like a bruise. He went inside and put on his boots. The drive out to the eastern fence line took 20 minutes on the dirt track that wound between the scrub and the dry wash, and by the time Hector had loaded Dulce into the trailer and driven out and unloaded her again and swung up into the saddle, the iron had gone out of the sky and the morning had finally decided to become itself blue and wide and the temperature of a held breath. October in this part of New Mexico was like that. It didn't waste warmth. Every degree of heat the sun offered was a negotiation. Dulce was agitated from the moment her hooves touched the ground. She was a buckskin quarter horse, 14 years old, built low and solid, with a disposition Hector's mother had once described as sensibly suspicious, which meant she didn't spook at shadows, but she paid attention to things that deserved attention. She paid attention now. Her ears were forward and rigid, rotating like small radar dishes toward the east, and her walk had the compressed, coiled quality of an animal that had already decided it might need to run and was simply waiting for confirmation. "Easy," Hector said, keeping his voice level and unhurried. "We're just looking." Dulce flicked one ear back at him, acknowledging, and kept her other pointed east. They rode the fence line in silence, Hector watching the mesa grow larger ahead of them, the scrub oak and pinyon thinning as the red rock became more predominant and the land tilted upward. The morning air smelled of iron and something else beneath it, something acrid and sharp like ozone after lightning but warmer, almost chemical with an undertone that reminded Hector faintly of the inside of a machine shop. Not unpleasant exactly, just wrong. Wrong the way that first smell of smoke from a neighbor's field was wrong, not dangerous yet, but carrying the grammar of danger in it. He saw the gouge when they came around the last shoulder of rock before the mesa's flat top opened up, and he pulled Dulce to a stop and sat still in the saddle for a long moment just looking. The mesa had been wounded. There was no other word for what had happened to it. A long scar ran diagonally across its surface, maybe 300 yards of scorched and shattered red rock, beginning at the southern edge where something massive had first made contact with the earth and ending at a jagged pile of debris near the center of the flat. The rock on either side of the gouge was blackened, and in places it had fused and glazed, as though it had briefly become something molten before the heat passed and left it hardened and alien. Fragments of material that did not belong to the mesa were scattered across the stone, panels of something iridescent that caught the morning light and threw it back in colors that shouldn't have come from metal, coiled tubes of translucent material that still faintly hummed, and pieces of structural framing that had been designed to bear tremendous loads and had been bent anyway. At the far end of the scar, where the momentum of whatever had struck had finally spent itself, sat the largest piece of wreckage, a pod of some kind, roughly the dimensions of a horse trailer, built from that same iridescent material as the scattered panels but intact on 3 sides. Its fourth side had been violently opened, not torn or crushed, Hector noticed, but opened. The seams along the pod's long edge had separated in a controlled way, panels folded back, latch mechanisms disengaged. Someone had let it open, or something inside had let itself out. The consortium's announcement had played on his truck radio on the way over, a brief measured broadcast on the emergency channel that he'd mostly ignored because emergency broadcasts these days could mean anything from a tornado watch to a scheduled alien survey departure, and both were equally common in this part of the country since the consortium had established their monitoring station outside of Taos. He remembered now what the voice had said: unscheduled emergency stop, departed without incident. No harm to persons or property. He looked at the 300-yard scar in the ancient face of the mesa. He looked at the debris fields scattered across stone that his grandfather had walked. He thought about the word incident for a long moment. Dulce refused to go any closer. She planted all 4 feet and dropped her head and pushed it slightly to the side in that particular way that meant she had made a decision and was not, at this time, interested in reconsidering it. Hector knew that look. He'd been on the receiving end of it for 11 years. He didn't push. He dismounted, tied her reins to a juniper post where the rock gave way to scrub, and walked the rest of the way on foot. The mesa felt different under his boots than it ever had before. Hector had walked this ground hundreds of times, had come up here as a boy with his father to mend the northern fencing, had brought his nephew up here once to watch the meteor shower from a higher vantage, had walked it alone in the mornings sometimes when the world felt like too much, and he needed the particular silence that only high open ground could provide. He knew the way the rock felt underfoot, solid, granular, warm even in cold weather, because the sandstone held the previous day's sun long into the night. Now it felt like he was walking across something that was still deciding what it was. The fused patches were slightly slick. The fragments of alien material crunched differently from gravel, lighter somehow with a faint resonance, as though each piece was still carrying a tiny electrical charge. The acrid machine shop smell was stronger here, layered now with something that might have been heat-seared rock and something else beneath that, something biological, warm and alive and out of place. He moved toward the open pod slowly. There was no particular reason to rush. Whatever had been in it was either still there or it wasn't, and hurrying wouldn't change the answer. He'd learned that lesson ranching. Hurrying toward the problem never helped anything, it just meant you arrived at the problem winded. The pod's interior, when he reached it and looked inside, was empty except for a thick padding of some material he couldn't identify, dark, almost like velvet in texture, deeply molded in a shape that suggested whatever it had held had been cradled, not carried. The shape in the padding was roughly oval, maybe 3 feet long, and the material was warm to the touch even now, as though it had been designed to hold and sustain warmth rather than merely contain something. Around the oval indentation, small mechanical components had clearly functioned as climate regulators. He could see the nozzles, the sensors, the thin lines of tubing that had once carried something through the pod's walls. Whoever had loaded this pod had cared about what was inside it. Whoever had opened it and walked away had not. Hector stood at the edge of the pod and looked at the indentation in the warm velvet material and felt something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. He'd ranched long enough to know the difference between a feeling that meant danger and a feeling that meant wrong. This was wrong. Something had been here that was cared for, and the people who cared for it had left it behind, and the way they had left in a hurry with a story already prepared for the authorities suggested they had made a calculation. That the thing they'd left behind was not worth the complication of bringing along. He turned to go. The sun was fully up now, and he had fence to mend on the western pasture, and he had told himself that he was here only to look, only to understand the shape of what had happened so he could report it accurately to whoever ended up wanting a report. He was 3 steps from the pod when he stopped. The wind moved across the mesa. The juniper at the edge whispered. Far away, a hawk cried once and fell silent. And beneath all of it, so small and thread-thin that he would have missed it if the rest of the world had been any louder, he heard a sound that formed itself, improbably and unmistakably, into a word. The mamas. Hector Reyes did not move. He stood with one boot mid-stride and let the silence rush back in around that sound and waited to see if it would come again or if he had imagined it. He was not generally a man who imagined things. He was concrete and observational and had a deep, long-practiced skepticism of anything that couldn't be looked at directly. But he was also a man who had lived close to the land and close to animals for long enough to know that the world contained more kinds of communication than any schoolbook accounted for, and he did not immediately dismiss the sound. It came again, thinner this time, more exhausted, the single word fraying at its edges as though whoever was making it had been making it for a long time and was running low on the strength to continue. The mamas. It was coming from beneath the largest slab of the pod's broken outer casing, a panel roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide that had peeled away from the structure and tilted against a boulder to form a low triangle of shadow. The gap between the panel and the rock was barely 8 inches at its widest point. Hector crossed to it in 4 long strides, the unhurried walk entirely abandoned. He dropped to one knee on the scorched rock, planted his hands, and lowered his head to peer into the dark gap. 2 eyes looked back at him. They were amber, not the amber of a cat's eyes, which always carried something oblique and private in them. These eyes were direct and enormous relative to the face they occupied. The irises ringed with a thin line of deep copper, the pupils slightly elliptical and fixed on him with an expression that was not animal and not human, but held something of both. They blinked once slowly, deliberately, and then stayed open and fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel obscurely that he was being assessed. He took in the rest of the creature in the same slow inventory he used when approaching an injured animal, not staring, not moving, just gathering information with the peripheral patience of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether the next 30 minutes went smoothly or badly. The creature was small, genuinely small, no larger than a barn cat, and a thin one at that, curled in upon itself the way small living things curl when they are conserving everything they have left. Its scales were the deep blue-green of the river that ran through the canyon east of town, the kind of color that looks dark until the light hits it at the right angle, and suddenly it goes green and luminous, and you understand you've been underestimating it. The scales were smooth on the body and slightly ridged along the spine, and in the pale morning light that filtered into the gap, they caught the glow and threw it back in faint iridescence. It had wings. They were small, too small for the body even accounting for the creature's obvious youth, and they were pressed flat and close to its sides in the posture of something that had given up on flying and was now focused entirely on surviving. A tail, slender and articulated, curled around its hindquarters. The forelegs were tucked against its chest, and one of them was not tucked in the way the other was. It was held slightly inward, guarded, angled with the involuntary protectiveness of something in pain. Its sides moved, fast and shallow, the breathing of something running a deficit. The amber eyes watched him without blinking now, and they were full of something that hit Hector somewhere below the ribcage, not a dramatic impact, not the kind of feeling that makes a man gasp or reach or announce itself in any visible way. Just a quiet, deep recognition. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of calves separated from their mothers in bad weather, in the eyes of dogs left at fences, in the eyes of any creature that has been waiting for someone to come back and has begun, very recently, to understand that no one is coming back. It was not fear. Fear had an edge to it, a readiness, a direction. This was older than fear. This was the thing that was left when fear had been sustained for so long it had exhausted itself. He held still. He kept his face neutral and his breathing slow and his hands flat and visible against the rock. "Hey," he said, quiet, low, the same register he used with every frightened animal he'd ever approached. "Hey, I'm not going anywhere." The creature's sides stuttered, the breathing caught for a moment, changed rhythm. The amber eyes moved over his face in a slow, careful reading. The tiny foreleg, the injured one, twitched once and stilled. Then its mouth opened barely, showing the thin white edges of very small and very sharp teeth. And in a voice that was barely sound at all, a vibration more than a voice, the ghost of a voice, something that had been trying to be heard for hours in the wind and the cold and the silence of the abandoned mesa, it said the word again. "The mama." Hector felt the word land in the center of his chest like a coal. He had no children, had never had children by circumstance and then by the slow passage of years that makes certain absences permanent without ever making them painless. He had a nephew he adored and a sister he talked to every Sunday and a good dog that had died 2 years ago and left an absence in the house that he had not yet figured out how to fill. He was not an emotional man in the conventional sense. He didn't perform feeling, didn't announce it, didn't make it anyone else's problem. But he was a thorough man. He felt everything he felt all the way through quietly, and he dealt with it the same way he dealt with everything else, by deciding what the situation required and then doing that. The situation required his jacket. He took it off, his good canvas barn jacket, insulated, warm from his body, and without hesitation folded it into a thick pad in his hands. He didn't reach into the gap immediately. He held the jacket where the creature could see it, could smell it, could observe it, and make the determination that it needed to make. He gave it time, 30 seconds, a minute. The amber eyes moved from his face to the jacket and back to his face. Then he reached in, slowly. One hand palm up, sliding along the rock floor of the gap toward the creature, not grabbing, not lunging, just offering the warmth of his hand as an introduction to the warmth of the jacket. The creature watched his hand come closer. Every muscle in its small body was rigid with the effort of remaining still, with the war between the desperate need for warmth and the equally desperate fear of another disappointment. He could see the conflict in it, the trembling that was not entirely cold, the way the amber eyes darkened slightly with something like held breath. His fingertips made contact with the edge of one folded wing. He felt the scales, smooth, cool, the temperature of the rock around it, and he held his hand still and let the warmth of his palm do the work of speaking for him. The creature exhaled, a long, trembling release of held air like a bowstring finally allowed to relax. The rigidity went out of its body in stages, shoulders first, then spine, then tail uncurling slightly, and it leaned carefully, infinitesimally, as though testing whether the warmth would stay leaned against the warmth of his palm. Hector brought the jacket in with his other hand, moving with the slow and particular care of a man who understood that certain moments were fragile, and that the cost of rushing them was higher than the cost of any inconvenience patience might impose. He wrapped the creature in the jacket. He lifted it, and the mesa around him was silent and wide and burned, and the alien wreckage caught the morning light and threw it in colors that had no names, and somewhere behind him Dulce waited at the juniper post, and the world went on being the world. Hector Reyes stood up with a baby dragon folded against his chest inside his canvas jacket and looked at the scar in the mesa for a long moment. At the debris, the empty pod, the careful indentation in the warm velvet padding that had held something precious until the people responsible for it had made their calculation and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. And he felt something he rarely felt and almost never named. He felt angry. Not loudly, not in a way that changed his expression or his posture or the steadiness of his hands where they cradled the jacket and the small warm weight inside it. Just angry the way the desert gets angry when it hasn't rained in too long, quietly, fundamentally, with a patience that could outlast almost anything. "All right," he said to the creature and to the empty mesa and to no one else in particular. His voice was soft and even. "I've got you now, and we're going home." He turned from the wreckage and walked back toward Dulce, who was watching him come with her ears forward and her eyes wide, reading the shape of what he was carrying. Behind him, the scorched rock held its silence. The alien panels caught the light and through it. The empty pod breathed the last warmth out of its velvet lining and into the October air. The Galactic Consortium's vessel was already 4 light hours away, accelerating toward a scheduled rendezvous with its station near Jupiter. Its manifest had been updated. The line that had read Veldreth Hatchling Class 7 Biological Specimen Containment Unit 4 had been quietly reclassified. Specimen lost in transit. The Consortium did not look back. Hector Reyes did not look back either, but for entirely different reasons. He had somewhere to be. To be continued in Part 2, The Education of a Cowboy. The Education of a Cowboy. The drive back to the ranch house took 20 minutes. It felt longer. Hector kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting on the canvas jacket bundled in the passenger seat, and every 30 seconds or so he would glance sideways to confirm that the small rise and fall of breathing was still happening beneath the folds of insulated canvas. It was. Each time he looked, the same tiny rhythm was there, rapid, shallow, not quite right, but present, and present was enough for now. Present meant there was still something to work with. He had loaded Dulce back into the trailer first, giving the mare a long moment to stretch her nose toward the bundled jacket and take in the scent of what he was carrying. Dulce had blown a long breath through her nostrils, pulled her head back, and then after a pause that communicated everything about a horse's relationship with the unfamiliar, she had lowered her head and walked calmly into the trailer. Hector took that as a vote of cautious confidence, which was the best kind of vote Dulce ever cast. He drove carefully on the dirt track, avoiding the deeper ruts, keeping his speed down. The October morning had finished deciding to be beautiful and was now committed to it fully. The sky a hard, saturated blue above the mesa, the scrub oak gone gold and rust at its edges, the mountains in the west showing the first pale dusting of early snow on their highest points. It was the kind of morning that made a man understand why his grandfather had never once seriously considered leaving this land, even in the dry years, even when the money was bad and the fencing was falling and the cattle were thin. The jacket moved. Hector's hand pressed slightly firmer against the canvas, and he felt through the fabric the small repositioning, the creature turning its head or shifting its tucked forelimbs or simply adjusting to the vibration of the truck on the uneven track. Not distress, something more tentative than distress, something like the first cautious inventory of a new situation. "Almost there," he said quietly. The jacket stilled. Then from inside it, muffled by canvas and distance and something that might have been exhaustion or might have been sleep beginning, came a sound so small he felt it more than heard it. A low, thin hum, directionless, like the resonance of a single taut wire in a gentle wind. He didn't know then what that sound meant. He would learn over the following weeks that it was the equivalent of a sigh, a long, reluctant, finally permitted exhale of tension. The sound he would come to understand of a creature deciding against considerable prior evidence to try trusting something one more time. He drove the rest of the way home without speaking. Some silences deserved to be left whole. The first order of business was warmth. Hector's barn was old, built by his grandfather from timber and adobe brick, modified twice by his father and once by Hector himself after a bad winter took out the north wall, and it had the particular quality of all old barns, which was that it held its temperature stubbornly in either direction. In summer it was cool when everything outside was burning. In October, it was warmer than the outside air by a reliable margin, and Hector had long ago strung a series of heat lamps along the southern wall for the benefit of the occasional early lamb or the chickens on cold nights. He chose the corner stall, the smallest, the most enclosed, the one that shared two walls with the hay storage and therefore stayed warmest. He laid down fresh straw, thick and deep. He unfolded the jacket on top of it with the care of someone handling something that had already been dropped once too often by the universe, and he stepped back. The creature lay still for a moment, blinking at the shift in light and temperature. The barn's warmth hit it visibly. Hector could see the rigidity in its body begin to soften, the scales along its spine relaxing from their compressed, defensive overlay into something flatter and more natural. Its tail, which had been curled in a tight protective spiral against its body, loosened a single turn. Its amber eyes moved around the stall. Straw, wooden walls. The distant sound of Dulce settling into her own stall 2 spaces down. The warmth. The smell of hay and old timber and horses and the particular comfortable staleness of a barn that had been lived in consistently and well for 80 years. The amber eyes came back to Hector and stayed there. He held the gaze for a moment, then dropped his eyes first, a deliberate thing, the gesture of a man who knew how to communicate with creatures that read posture and intention better than words. Not a challenge, not dominance. Just a quiet declaration of non-threat offered in the only language that crossed every barrier between species without distortion. He left the heat lamp on low and went to the house to find something to feed it. The question of what to feed a baby dragon turned out to be significantly easier than Hector had anticipated. He'd taken stock of what he had, some cold roast beef from 2 nights ago, a pound of chicken livers he'd been meaning to use for fishing bait, a couple of link sausages left over from breakfast. He'd stood in front of the open refrigerator for a moment, arms crossed, thinking about what he knew of predatory animals, which was quite a lot, and what he knew of creatures with scales and wings, which was considerably less, and he'd taken the roast beef and the chicken livers and the sausages and put them all on a plate and carried it back to the barn. He set the plate on the stall floor, well within reach, and moved to the far corner and sat down on an overturned bucket and watched. The creature lifted its head. Its nostrils' narrow slits along the ridge of its snout flared once, twice, 3 times. Its eyes went to the plate. Something sharpened in its expression, the amber deepening, the pupils adjusting, the careful assessment of a mind running the calculation between desire and caution. Caution held for approximately 45 seconds. Then hunger won, as hunger generally does, and the creature moved. It was the first time Hector had seen it move with any purpose, and despite himself, despite the morning's strangeness and the ache across his shoulders from the careful drive and the dozen practical problems already arranging themselves in the back of his mind, he felt something lighten in his chest at the sight of it. It moved with a low, liquid grace, each foreleg placed deliberately, the injured one touching the straw with somewhat more caution than the other but bearing weight, which was a good sign, which meant the damage was pain rather than structural failure. The wings shifted for balance, instinctive small adjustments like a hawk repositioning on a perch. The tail counterweighted each step. It reached the plate and ate without ceremony, efficiently. The roast beef disappeared first, then the chicken livers, then the sausages. It was not a delicate eater, it was a hungry one, which was a different thing entirely, and Hector watched it with the straightforward satisfaction of someone who had been trying to feed something and was now watching that thing be fed. When the plate was clean, the creature sat back on its haunches and looked at the empty plate for a moment with an expression that Hector could only describe as thoughtful. Then it looked at him. "I'll get more," he said. It looked at the plate, then at him. Then, with the decisive and slightly imperious air of a creature that had absorbed this promise and filed it for future reference, it turned itself around twice on the straw, a behavior so recognizable, so perfectly and absurdly familiar, that Hector let out a long breath of surprised laughter before he could stop himself, and lay down in the warmth of the heat lamp and closed its amber eyes. He sat on the bucket for a while longer, listening to it breathe, watching the rhythm steady and deepen as sleep took hold. The rapid shallowness of the mesa's desperate cold was already gone from its breathing. What replaced it was slower, fuller, the breathing of a creature that had found, for the moment, sufficient warmth and sufficient food and sufficient silence to allow itself to rest. He went inside and cooked another pound of beef and let it cool and brought it back, and it was there in the morning when the creature woke. And the creature ate it without being prompted, and this, Hector decided, was the beginning of a working arrangement. He named her on the second day. He'd been putting it off, telling himself that nomming implied permanence, and that permanence implied a conversation he wasn't yet ready to have with the practical part of his brain that was already muttering things about legality and government agencies and the consortium's ownership classifications. But by the second morning, the creature had become inadequate in a way that he couldn't precisely explain, except to say that she was already behaving like someone with a name, someone with preferences and opinions and a specific and growing relationship to the space she occupied, and referring to her as the creature felt, by the second day, not merely inadequate but vaguely rude. He named her Mesa because she had come from the Mesa, and because the word fit in his mouth the same way the place always had solid, short, a word with good rock in it. He said it quietly in the barn that morning, just spoke it into the air of the stall without ceremony or explanation, and Mesa lifted her head and looked at him with an expression that suggested she found the name at least acceptable, which was more than he'd gotten from Dulce when he'd named her. She was smarter than he had any framework to anticipate. This became apparent quickly, and it continued to become more apparent each day in a way that was not gradual so much as cumulative, each new demonstration of intelligence building on the last until, by the end of the first week, Hector had substantially revised every assumption he'd walked into the barn with on that first morning. By the second day, she had identified the heat lamp as the source of warmth and had taken to sitting directly beneath it with her good foreleg folded under her chin and her eyes half closed in an expression of such profound and deliberate satisfaction that it made the barn feel, somehow, more lived in than it had before. Not just occupied, inhabited. By the third day, she had mapped Hector's schedule with a precision that unsettled him a little if he was honest about it. He appeared in the barn at 6, noon, and 7. By the fourth day, she was watching the barn door with focused attention approximately 3 minutes before each of those times, as though she had internalized the rhythm of his days and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to her expectations. He tested this on the fifth day by arriving at 6:15 instead of 6, deliberately curious. He heard her before he reached the barn, a low, impatient sound, not quite a vocalization, but carrying the unmistakable intonation of someone who has been waiting and would like that acknowledged. He was never late again. The foreleg healed with a speed that made him quietly revise every assumption he'd made about the creature's biology. He'd splinted it carefully on the second day, a popsicle stick from the kitchen drawer and medical tape, applied while Mesa watched him with the concentrated and slightly skeptical attention of a patient who has decided to permit the procedure but reserves the right to a second opinion. She held still throughout. Not passively still, not the stillness of an animal too frightened to move, but the deliberate stillness of someone cooperating with something they've assessed and found acceptable. By the sixth day, the splint was redundant. By the 10th, she was using the foreleg with full and apparently painless confidence. The scales grew back where they'd been scraped raw. The wings, when she extended them, which she began to do each morning in a long, careful stretch that looked like nothing so much as a deliberate physical practice, were clearly larger than they had been on the first day, visibly larger, in a way that shouldn't have been possible in 10 days but was plainly happening. She ate 2 pounds of raw beef a day. She grew. Her appetite for food was matched, Hector began to notice, by an appetite for information that was harder to feed but no less genuine. She watched everything, not with the diffuse attention of an animal taking in its environment but with the focused, sequential attention of a mind sorting and filing and cross-referencing. She watched the way he filled the water trough. She watched the way Dulce responded to his voice. She watched the chickens with an analytical intensity that he'd been forced to address on the fourth day. "No," he'd said firmly, pointing at the hens. Mesa had turned to look at him with her head tilted slightly, the amber eyes going from his face to the chickens and back to his face in a triangulation that was clearly processing the instruction rather than simply reacting to the tone of it. There was a moment, 3 full seconds of visible, active consideration, and then she had turned away from the chickens with the air of someone who has weighed a preference against a principle and reached a conclusion. She never touched the chickens, not once in all the weeks that followed. But what confirmed for Hector, beyond any remaining doubt, that Mesa was something qualitatively different from any animal he had ever worked with, something that required a different word than animal. A different category entirely, was the afternoon of the 9th day, when he made the mistake of talking to himself in the barn while he was replacing the water line. He'd been muttering under his breath about the threading on the coupling joint, which was stripped and refusing to cooperate, and he'd said, with the weary specificity of a man who has fought this particular battle before, "Come on. Just come on, you stubborn thing, just turn." Mesa, who had been watching him from the corner of the stall, said, "Turn." It was not his word. It was not an echo, not the way a parrot echoes, mechanical, arbitrary, emptied of meaning. It was his word in her voice, which was not a human voice but was doing what a human voice did with the word, placing it in context, applying it to the situation, using it. She was looking at the coupling. She said turn the way a person says turn when they are agreeing that something should be turned and reinforcing the intention with language. Hector sat back on his heels and looked at her for a long time. Yeah, he said finally to the coupling and to Mesa, and to whatever understanding had just quietly rearranged itself in the back of his mind. Turn. After that, he started talking more in the barn. The consortium's communication arrived on the 11th day, heralded by a tone on his satellite phone he'd never heard before, not the standard emergency frequency, not anything in the usual range of agricultural alerts or weather bulletins or county ordinances. A tone that was precise and slightly too perfect. The way synthesized sound was always slightly too perfect, carrying within it the harmonic signature of something that had been generated by a system that had never learned the small, beautiful imperfections of natural acoustics. Hector was in the kitchen drinking his afternoon coffee when it came. He picked up the phone and listened. The voice was translated. He could hear the machinery of translation in it, the same quality as the emergency broadcast from 11 days ago, technically fluent and emotionally empty in the way of something that had learned vocabulary without learning weight. It informed him, in measured and entirely untroubled language, that a biological specimen of the classification Veldreth hatchling had been separated from its registered transport during an unscheduled landing event, and that the consortium's registry of biological assets had flagged the specimen as unrecovered, and that a retrieval team would be dispatched to his registered address at his earliest convenience to recover said specimen and complete the manifest. Specimen, the word appeared 3 times in a message that was less than 2 minutes long. Hector listened to it twice. He stood at his kitchen window looking out at the barn while he listened, at the old adobe walls his grandfather had laid, at the October light falling warm and gold on the dust of the yard, at the familiar shape of the structure that had been, in his experience, the place where things that needed care came to receive it. He put the phone down on the counter. He picked it up again and called his cousin Fernanda in Albuquerque, who practiced law in a building downtown with a cactus in the lobby and a reputation for not backing down from anything. And he told her what he'd found on the mesa and what he'd been doing with it for 11 days and what the phone had just told him. There was a silence on Fernanda's end that he recognized as the silence of someone organizing a significant amount of information quickly. They called her a specimen, he said. I heard you, Fernanda said. How big is she now? He thought about it. Bigger than a barn cat, smaller than a border collie, getting closer to the border collie end of things. Is she responding to her name? She's been responding to her name since day 4, Hector said. She said her first English word on day 9. Another silence, longer this time. Tell them, Fernanda said, that you need to verify the retrieval authorization. Tell them the communication was unclear and you require documentation. Use the word documentation at least twice. Stall them. I'll make some calls and figure out what framework we're operating in before we say anything definitive. How long do you need? As long as you can give me. Hector looked out at the barn. The afternoon light had shifted, going amber and long across the yard, and through the barn's open upper door he could see, just barely, the faint green-blue iridescence of scales catching that amber light Mesa, up on the hay bale she'd claimed as her preferred high vantage point, watching the yard with the calm proprietary attention of someone surveying what is theirs. Take your time, he told Fernanda. He hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, his coffee going cold on the counter, looking at the barn with the specific quality of expression of a man who has already made a decision and is now simply watching the world arrange itself around the fact of it. Then he put his hat on and went to do the evening feeding. In the weeks that followed, Hector Reyes received 2 additional communications from the consortium, both of which he forwarded to Fernanda and both of which used the word specimen, with a frequency that, each time he read them, produced in him the same quiet, sustained, bedrock anger he'd felt standing on the mesa looking at the empty pod. Mesa, for her part, appeared entirely unconcerned with the administrative machinery accumulating around her existence. She was busy with other things. She learned the word no on the 14th day and deployed it immediately and with evident satisfaction, applying it to situations she'd previously communicated about only through the eloquence of turning away and presenting her tale. Now she had the word. The word in her voice with her precise and deliberate enunciation had a quality of finality that Hector recognized and respected. No from Mesa was not negotiation. It was a concluded assessment. She learned warm and cold, and here and food and dulce, saying the mare's name with an extra vowel on the end that made it sound like a different word in a language Hector didn't know. And Dulce, for reasons of her own, had stopped being nervous around Mesa entirely by the 3rd week, and would sometimes stand at the low rail of the connecting fence and companionably say nothing at all while Mesa sat on her hay bale and said nothing at all back. The 2 of them engaged in the particular comfortable silence of creatures that have reached an understanding. She learned Hector's name on the 18th day. She said it carefully, 3 syllables, the middle one slightly elongated, the consonants clean and precise. He was crossing the barn with the afternoon feed when she said it, and he stopped and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the amber eyes steady and the word hanging in the air between them like something placed there deliberately. "Yeah," he said, "that's me." She said it again with a slight different intonation, not a question, not exactly, but something in the register of confirmation, of taking inventory, of recording. He set down the feed and crossed to the hay bale and sat on the lower rail of the stall fence, which put them approximately at eye level. And she looked at him with the enormous amber eyes, and he looked at her with his own ordinary brown ones. And neither of them said anything for a while, and the barn was warm and quiet around them. And the October light went long and gold through the upper door and lay across the straw in a way that made everything it touched look briefly important. She did not say "Mama" anymore. He noticed this gradually, the way you notice the absence of a sound that has been present long enough to become part of the texture of things. She had said it on the mesa. She had said it twice in the truck, quiet and muffled beneath the canvas. She had said it once on the first night in the stall in the dark, just before the breathing deepened into sleep. After that, not once. He didn't interpret this as forgetting. He was not sentimental enough for that particular misreading, and he respected Mesa too much for it. He interpreted it instead the way he interpreted most things, practically directly, as information about the current state of affairs. She wasn't calling for something lost anymore. She was learning the name of what she'd found. To be continued in Part 3, What a Cowboy Considers Kin. What a Cowboy Considers Kin. The retrieval team arrived on a Tuesday. Hector knew they were coming. Fernanda had called him the night before, her voice carrying the particular quality of controlled urgency that he'd come to associate with her professional mode. The mode where she spoke faster than usual and chose her words with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. 3 of them, she'd said, consortium registry officials. They've cleared the paperwork through the Federal Liaison Office in Santa Fe, which means they've done this before and they know the procedural channels. They'll be professional about it. Polite even. Don't let the politeness confuse you about what they're there to do. It won't, Hector had said. And Hector, a pause, don't say anything about Mesa's language development, not yet. Let me control when that enters the conversation. He'd agreed, and then he'd gone to the barn and sat with Mesa for an hour in the evening quiet, and he hadn't said anything about any of it, and she had sat on her hay bale watching him with the amber eyes that missed very little and said nothing either, and the barn held its comfortable warmth around them like it always did. He slept without difficulty. He'd found over the course of his life that decisions already made had a way of simplifying everything that came after them, including sleep. The consortium vehicle came up the dirt road at 9 in the morning, and it was unlike any vehicle Hector had seen arrive on his property in 43 years, which was saying something, because his property had been arrived at by cattle, trucks, and county inspectors and a FEMA representative after the flood of 2019, and once, memorably, a film crew who had mistaken his land for a location they'd scouted 40 miles east. The consortium vehicle was long and low and made no sound that the human ear could comfortably classify as mechanical. A faint resonance, more felt than heard, like the bass note of something very large vibrating in a register just below the threshold of ordinary perception. It stopped in the yard with a precision that suggested parking was not a concept it had difficulty with. 3 figures emerged. They were tall, not grotesquely so, not in the way of science fiction posters or the dramatic renderings that newspapers still occasionally ran when they needed to illustrate a story about interspecies relations. Just tall in the way that some people are tall, a head above Hector's 6 feet, with the proportional elongation of a species that had presumably evolved under different gravitational conditions. Their skin was gray, not an unhealthy gray, not the gray of illness or cold, but the gray of good stone, the gray of the mesa in deep shadow, even-toned and matte. Their faces were organized differently from human faces, wider at the forehead, the eyes set further apart and of a uniform pale amber that in another context Hector might have found beautiful. Their clothing was functional dark, without insignia that he could read. They moved across his yard with the measured confidence of people who were used to arriving in places where they were not entirely welcome, and had made their peace with that fact as a professional condition. Hector stood on his porch. He had not dressed differently for this. He wore what he wore every day, worn jeans, his good boots, a flannel shirt, his hat. He had his coffee with him because it was 9 in the morning, and at 9 in the morning Hector Reyes had his coffee, and nothing in the consortium's registry of biological assets was going to change that. Fernanda stood beside him, and she had dressed differently for this. She had driven up from Albuquerque that morning in a suit that managed to look both professional and like a statement of intent, and she carried her folder of documents with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by the weight of what she was prepared to argue. The lead official, Hector, assigned this role to the one who walked slightly ahead of the others, though he couldn't have said what exactly communicated rank in their movement, stopped at the foot of the porch steps and produced a translation device from somewhere inside its clothing. The device was small, matte-finished, and when it spoke in the same perfectly synthesized voice as the phone messages, carrying that same quality of technical fluency and emotional vacancy. "Mr. Reyes," the voice said, "we represent the Galactic Consortium Registry of Biological Assets. We are here to recover a Veldrath hatchling registry designation VDH7741, which was separated from its transport on or about 17 days ago, and which our tracking data indicates has been in the proximity of this location since that time. We appreciate your cooperation." Hector took a sip of his coffee. "Morning," he said. The lead official waited. Its two companions stood slightly back and to either side, and their pale amber eyes moved across the yard, the barn, the house, the fence line, taking inventory in the thorough and methodical way of people trained to account for things. "We'd like to collect the specimen and complete our manifest," the translated voice continued. "The process should be brief. We have a containment unit prepared." There was the word again, specimen, delivered in the same tone one might use to discuss a misplaced piece of equipment, a filing error, an administrative inconvenience that had persisted 17 days longer than it should have. Hector looked at the lead official for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to Fernanda. Fernanda opened her folders. What followed was not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums delivered with theatrical weight, none of the architecture of conflict that stories tend to impose on moments of genuine disagreement between parties who both believe they are correct. It was instead a conversation, long, careful, and conducted with the punctilious politeness of people who are each in possession of documentation they consider authoritative, and are in the process of discovering that the other party's documentation is more complicated than anticipated. Fernanda began with the consortium's own Charter of Sapient Welfare, a document the registry officials clearly knew, because there was a perceptible shift in their posture when she named it, a fractional realignment that communicated something in the register of increased attention. The charter, Fernanda explained, contained in its 7th section a designation framework for beings capable of demonstrating self-directed symbolic communication. Any being meeting that threshold could not, under consortium law, be classified as cargo or specimen or registered asset. Any being meeting that threshold was, by the charter's own language, a sapient individual. The lead official's translation device produced a response about the Veldrath classification framework and the species-specific developmental timeline and the registry's established protocols for hatchling transport, all of which was delivered in the same measured synthetic cadence, and all of which amounted to a sophisticated version of "that threshold does not apply here." Fernanda produced a secondary document, a legal ruling from a case adjudicated on a planet called Veth IV, which the consortium's own arbitration body had decided 40 years ago. She summarized it without reading directly from it, because Fernanda never read directly from documents she could recite from memory. The officials conferred among themselves in a language the translation device did not render for Hector's benefit, which told him that what they were saying was either too technical for general translation or not intended for him to hear, and either way he didn't mind. He drank his coffee. He looked at the barn. He knew with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 4 decades reading the weather and the land and the animals in his care, that the legal argument, however correct it was, however well Fernanda wielded it, was not going to be sufficient by itself. Legal arguments were structures. Structures required foundations. And the foundation that Fernanda had not yet been able to lay, because it existed in the barn and not in the folder, was Mesa herself. He set down his coffee cup on the porch railing. "Excuse me a moment," he said. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses, and the particular dusty animal contentment that accumulated in old structures over decades of being used well. Hector walked to the corner stall and found Mesa where she usually was in the mid-morning, on the hay bale, but not idle. She had found sometime in the 2nd week that the corner of the stall where the 2 walls met cast a specific shadow pattern in the morning light, and she had taken to sitting at the edge of that shadow and watching the barn's interior through it, which Hector had come to think of privately as her version of reading. The same focused, absorptive quiet, the same quality of a mind actively engaged with the information coming in. She looked at him when he entered. The amber eyes moved to his face and stayed there, reading him in the way she always read him, directly, sequentially, without the social indirection that humans often use to soften the act of paying attention to one another. Mesa had never learned social indirection. She had learned directness the way she learned everything, by deciding it was useful and then applying it comprehensively. He crouched down so they were at eye level, which was the position he'd developed over the past 2 weeks as their standard for conversations that were more than functional. Feed schedules and training corrections could be conducted standing. This was different. There are people outside, he said. 3 of them, they came from the consortium. Mesa was still, not the stillness of not understanding, he knew that stillness, the slightly unfocused quality it had, the way her head tilted when she was parsing unfamiliar words. This was the stillness of understanding and considering what to do with the understanding. They want to take you back, he said. He kept his voice even. He owed her that, the truth delivered without the distortion of his own feelings about it, which were considerable but not hers to carry. They say you belong to them, that you're part of their program. A long silence. The barn settled around them, an old timber sound, a comfortable sound. Fernanda is arguing with them, he said. She's good at arguing, she might win on the law, he paused. But I thought you should know, and I thought, he stopped, started again. I thought it should be your call. If you want to go, I won't stop it. If you want to stay, he looked at her steadily. Then we've got more arguing to do. Mesa looked at him for a long moment with the amber eyes. Then she looked at the barn door, then at the door again. Her tail moved, a slow, single sweep across the surface of the hay bale, the gesture he'd come to understand as thought in motion, the physical expression of a mind working through something. She climbed down from the hay bale. She walked to the barn door and looked out into the yard at the 3 tall gray figures standing in the morning light beside their soundless vehicle, and at Fernanda with her folder on the porch, and at the wide New Mexico sky above all of it. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she turned around, walked back across the barn floor and sat down beside Hector's boot. Not behind it, not pressed against it in the posture of fear, not sheltering, beside it. The distinction mattered and Hector understood it, and he stood up from his crouch and felt something settle in him that had been in motion since the morning on the mesa, something that had not been uncertain exactly, but that had needed this moment to complete itself. All right then, he said. He walked back out into the yard and Mesa walked beside him. The effect on the 3 officials was not dramatic in any theatrical sense. They did not step back or exclaim or produce any visible response that could be described as surprise. But their posture shifted, all 3 of them simultaneously, in a way that was too coordinated to be coincidence and too subtle to be performance. The pale amber eyes moved from Hector to Mesa and stayed there, and something changed in the quality of attention they were paying to the morning. Mesa walked to the center of the yard and sat. She folded her good foreleg beneath her and let the other rest naturally on the ground. The injury was long healed, but she sometimes still favored it in formal situations, a habit Hector had noticed without comment. Her wings were folded close and neat against her back. Her tail was still. Her spine was straight. She looked at the lead official. The lead official's translation device said something in Galactic Standard directed at Mesa. Hector didn't catch the specifics. The translation device rendered it for the official's use, not for his, but the intonation had the shape of a question, something open-ended, something that expected a response. Mesa looked at the device, then she looked at the official, then she looked at Hector. Your call, he said, same as he'd said in the barn. Mesa turned back to the lead official. And in a voice that was not a human voice but was doing what human voices do with deliberate communication, placing weight behind words, conveying intention, refusing to be ambient noise, she said 3 words. 2 of them were in Galactic Standard, which she had apparently absorbed from the translation device's output over the past week, with the same comprehensive thoroughness she applied to everything. One of them was English. The English word was no. The silence that followed had texture to it. The officials conferred again in their untranslated language, and this time the conference was longer, and at the end of it the lead official addressed Fernanda rather than Hector. And the conversation that had been about documentation and classification frameworks shifted into something that moved faster and required Fernanda to produce more pages from her folder, and at one point to use her own phone to pull up the specific subarticle of the Veth IV ruling that established communication as the qualifying threshold rather than communication complexity. Hector stood in the yard in the morning sun. Mesa sat beside his boot. Dulce watched from the corral fence with her ears forward and her expression one of measured equine judgment. The sky was very blue, the mountains were very still. The retrieval team left without Mesa. They left with a formal acknowledgement that the situation required arbitration review, which was, as Fernanda explained to Hector afterward, sitting on his porch with a glass of his good bourbon, about as close to a concession as a consortium registry official was structurally capable of offering in the field. They had taken recordings. They had submitted documentation. They had, in the precise and procedural language of bureaucratic defeat, flagged the case for jurisdictional determination. How long? Hector asked. For the arbitration, could be weeks, could be months. Fernanda turned her glass in her hands, watching the Bourbon catch the afternoon light. But they won't send another retrieval team while it's under active review. That would be a procedural violation. They're rules people, Hector. They follow their own rules. It's actually one of the more useful things about them. And the arbitration itself. Fernanda was quiet for a moment. I've never argued a case like this before, she said, which from Fernanda was a statement of fact rather than uncertainty, a marking of terrain rather than a confession of doubt. Nobody has, that's actually the point. The Veldreth breeding program has a legal framework that was written before the sapient designation question was tested in this specific context. Before they had a hatchling who learned 17 words of Galactic Standard in 2 weeks and told a registry official no in 2 languages simultaneously. She paused. I think we win. I think the charter language is clear and the Veth IV precedent holds. But I want you prepared for the fact that this is going to take time and it is going to be contested and it is going to involve people and institutions that are much larger than either of us. Hector looked out at the yard. Mesa was in the barn. He could see the faint, iridescent shift of her scales through the upper door where she'd resumed her post on the hay bale. The afternoon light was going amber, same as it did every day at this hour, same as it had done every day of his life on this land. I've got time, he said. What followed was 6 weeks of the most paperwork Hector had produced since the estate proceedings after his father's death, and those had been bad enough that he'd sworn afterward to keep his affairs simple for the rest of his life, which he largely had, and which made this particular avalanche of documentation feel both ironic and, in some obscure way, appropriate, as though the universe had been saving it up. He submitted a formal statement to the consortium's arbitration body. Fernanda submitted 40 pages of legal argument. Mesa submitted a statement, which Fernanda drafted with Mesa's direct participation over 2 mornings in the barn, using the translation device that the consortium had left behind for ongoing communication purposes. The statement was 9 sentences long. It contained the word no 3 times in 2 languages. Its final sentence, which Mesa had added in Galactic Standard without Fernanda's prompting, and which the translation device had rendered into English as something approximately equivalent to I am not a thing that was lost. I am a person who stayed, was quoted in full in the arbitration body's preliminary findings. The arbitration body had not, in its 400-year history, processed a case quite like this one. Fernanda told him this with what he had come to recognize as her version of satisfaction, a slight elevation of tone, a clipped precision to her sentences that meant she was pleased. The Veldreth breeding program filed 3 objections. The consortium's regional oversight committee filed a request for a supplemental behavioral assessment. 2 different academic institutions filed what Fernanda called friend of the court submissions, one arguing for Mesa's sapient designation based on the communication evidence, one arguing against it based on developmental biology, and both of them, Fernanda noted dryly, citing each other's work to reach opposite conclusions. Through all of it, Mesa remained largely indifferent to the machinery of the case accumulating around her existence. She was busy. She was growing. By the 5th week of the arbitration process, she was the size of a large dog, a tall one, long in the spine, with the wings now proportional enough that she spread them each morning in a stretch that spanned most of the stall's width and made the chickens, 8 feet away in their separate enclosure, go very still. Her scales had deepened further, the blue-green going darker and richer, and in direct sunlight they were the color of the sky reflected in deep water, a color Hector had no precise name for and did not try to name. Her amber eyes had developed additional expressiveness, or perhaps he had simply learned to read it better, the way you learn to read any face that matters to you, the vocabulary of its particular arrangements. She spoke more every week. English and Galactic Standard both, the 2 languages apparently occupying equivalent space in her mind, neither primary, both useful. She learned the words for things that interested her, sky, fence, mountain, horse, and she learned the words for things that mattered to her, here, stay, mine, yours, and she learned the words for the abstractions she was working out, which were harder and came more slowly but came, fair, wrong, wait, trust. She learned family on a Thursday, from a conversation between Hector and Fernanda that she had listened to from the barn doorway without either of them knowing she was there. Fernanda had been explaining the legal concept of wardship, which was the framework she was pursuing before the arbitration body, and she had used the word family in the context of what wardship established, and Mesa had appeared in the doorway with an expression that meant she was adding something to an internal list and needed to confirm the definition. Family, she had said, directing it at Hector. He had looked at her for a moment, then at Fernanda, who had the expression of someone watching something she will describe precisely for the rest of her professional life. Yeah, Hector said, family. Mesa had said the word again, once more quietly, the way she said things when she was moving them from tentative to certain. Then she had gone back to the barns. The ruling came on a Thursday morning in the third week of November, when the mountains had gone fully white at their peaks, and the air on the ranch had the clean structural cold of a season that had decided to be itself. Hector was mending fence in the east pasture when his phone buzzed in his coat pocket, and he straightened and took it out and read the notification, and then he sat down on a rock and read it again more slowly, the way he read everything that mattered. The arbitration body's finding was 12 pages long, of which Hector read 3 before the structure of the conclusion became clear. Mesa, designated VDH 7741 in the consortium's registry of biological assets, had demonstrated sapient capability under Article 7 of the Galactic Consortium Charter of Sapient Welfare, specifically through self-directed symbolic communication in 2 languages, demonstrable language acquisition, and the capacity for reason preference expressed through direct refusal. The specimen classification was formally vacated. The Veldreth breeding program's ownership claim was found to be without legal standing under the charter, superseded by the sapient designation. The question of ongoing guardianship was resolved through the wardship framework Fernanda had argued, establishing Hector Reyes as legal guardian with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed under both consortium law and through a bilateral treaty that Hector had not previously known existed, the laws of the United States. At the bottom of the finding, in the dry and administrative language of institutional conclusion, was a single line that the arbitration body had clearly added as a matter of record rather than a matter of feeling, and that nonetheless landed differently than the rest of the document. It is the finding of this body that the being known as Mesa Reyes is a person, and shall be recognized as such in all future proceedings and classifications. Hector sat on the rock and looked at the mountains for a long time. The peaks were very white. The sky above them was very blue. A hawk turned on a thermal somewhere above the mesa, easy and patient, its attention on whatever moved below. He heard Mesa before he saw her, the sound of her moving through the dry scrub to the east, the particular cadence of her gait that he could now identify as accurately as he could identify Dulce's, the rhythmic crunch and pause of a creature moving with purpose and not in any hurry about it. She had been tracking him by scent for weeks now, following the thread of his presence across the land with a confidence that had grown from cautious to habitual to simply the way things were, the way Dulce always knew which direction he was in, the way the barn cats appeared at the kitchen door precisely when he was opening a can of anything. She came through the last line of scrub and stopped when she saw him on the rock, reading the stillness of his posture. The amber eyes moved over him in the familiar inventory, face, hands, shoulders, the set of his jaw, and then she crossed the remaining distance and climbed up on the rock beside him, which was large enough for both of them if she tucked her wings close, which she did. She looked at the mountains, he looked at the mountains. The hawk above the mesa made another long, unhurried circle. "They ruled," he said. "She waited." "They said you're a person." He paused, looking for the right words, which was not usually something he struggled with because he generally said fewer words than he struggled with, but this moment seemed to deserve the effort. "Legal ward, it means I'm responsible for you, means you have rights." Another pause. "Means you're mine to look after and I'm yours to rely on, and the law has to honor that now." Mesa turned her head and looked at him. The amber eyes were steady and direct in the way they were always steady and direct, without performance and without distance, just the clear attention of a person paying attention to another person. "Family," she said. It was not a question. She had moved that word from tentative to certain 3 weeks ago, and she was not moving it back. "Families," he agreed. She turned back to the mountains. Her tail curved around itself in that loose, comfortable spiral she used when she was content, and she leaned barely, just slightly, the smallest possible degree of lean that still communicated lean, against his shoulder. He did not move away from it. He did not comment on it. He simply let it be what it was. The hawk above the mesa tilted its wings and rose on the thermal and grew small against the blue sky. Hector put his hat back on. "Fence won't fix itself," he said. Mesa made the sound he knew as acknowledgement, that low, single-note hum, brief and certain, and dropped down from the rock and stretched her wings once in the cold morning air, the full span of them opening and closing in the deliberate daily practice that was already in the 4th week, measurably more powerful than the first. Then she folded them close and fell into step beside him, and they walked back through the dry scrub toward the fence line with the mountains ahead and the mesa behind, and the cold November sky above it all, wide and blue, and indifferent to everything that mattered and everything that didn't. The Galactic Consortium's databases were already processing the updated classification. The Veldreth breeding program had 48 hours to file an appeal and had not yet decided whether to bother. Fernanda in Albuquerque was opening the first of what would become several new case files. because the Mesa Ray's ruling had apparently produced more interest in the legal community, both terrestrial and interstellar, than she had anticipated, and 3 different law students had already emailed asking if she needed research assistance. None of that was Hector's problem today. Today he had fence to mend in the east pasture, on land his grandfather had bought and his father had worked and he had kept and would pass on eventually to whoever came after. The land didn't care about consortium rulings or arbitration frameworks or the administrative ripples spreading outward through 4-star systems from a 12-page document with a single important line at the bottom of it. The land cared about fence, about water, about the work that kept it. He picked up the fencing tool from where he'd left it at the post and got back to it. Mesa sat nearby, not in his way, never in his way, but close enough that the warmth of her presence was a constant, and watched the hawk above the mesa with the focused amber gaze of a creature who was learning the sky the same way she learned everything else. Thoroughly, patiently, with the long confidence of someone who understood that she had time. She did have time, they both did. That was the thing about family, it didn't end when the day did. Some things the consortium never quite understood about humans. That for them, the weight of a thing was never determined by what it was classified as, only by how much it was loved. Mesa Rays weighed in their registry precisely nothing. In one old barn in New Mexico, in the ledger that actually mattered, she was everything.